There'll probably be a number of other individuals joining us, but I see a number of familiar faces already. Thank you all for joining us for this first session on mainstreaming climate change resilience. There's not much to be said. It's safe to say that this is the first online training for the climate resilience community that the GO program has developed and is implementing with the support of ODI and Rombo. We're very pleased to have identified experienced and competent service providers that they are. I think what's going to be delivered over this coming week is well adapted in our estimation to that, which will be useful to the overseas countries and territories that are beneficiary to the GO program and who are our partners today. And I say that because we did at the outset of the GO program, my colleagues and I did quite a bit of outreach to inquire what it was that what value added our program could bring and what sort of training would be appropriate. So this series is born out of that those discussions and that input that we garnered from all of you who are connecting today or who might connect and see this recorded session hereafter, because it'll be available on the Go platform. There's a number of other individuals from the Go team who are connected. Some of our regional coordinators and some of my colleagues who are based in Paris with me. So we'll be periodically tuning in to follow, and we look forward to exchanges and discussions, and want to thank everybody for making time in what is surely busy schedules and carving out time to participate in this training and exchange series. And I think I've said everything I wanted to say at this point in time. So thank you, Sandrine.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So good afternoon or good morning, everybody. My name is Sandrine Denain. I'm a senior consultant in Rumble. So Rumble is an international consulting, engineering, and architecture company. And I am part of the French climate unit, and we're dealing with climate change, resilience, adaptation. We're working on different aspects of adaptation, so climate risk assessments, support to development of climate services, the support to climate governance and climate mainstreaming we're dealing with in this Go community, on monitoring and evaluating systems, which we are going to go through as well during the training. And we support as well the development of action plans, feasibility studies, nature-based solutions, etc., which are also part of this Go resilience community. So just to say a few words about this community. So the objectives is really to help you, to support you, to mainstream resilience in sectoral policies or action plans. And throughout the different activities we were going to develop, the objectives is really to give you tools, support to identify which one are your barriers to mainstream adaptation and resilience, and which levers we can find and to help you to go further in this mainstreaming work. So we will propose you a quick governance scanner, which is a tool we are presently developing. It will be presenting in one of the sessions, the next training session on Thursdays. We will also develop catalogs of best practices related to mainstreaming, but also to more specific resilience activities related to coastal management, floods management, water management related to agriculture and food systems. So it's just a beginning of the story we'll write together. And I give you the floor, Matt, to enter in the subject today. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandrine. Thank you very much. And yeah, so welcome everybody. We've been very excited about running these sessions. So this first one is an introductory session. It's kind of designed for everybody to get to know each other. And it's kind of got two parts really. So as the title suggests, it's about exploring institutional and policy frameworks for adapting to climate change at all levels. So the first part of the session, we'll be talking a lot about different governance frameworks, about different adaptation frameworks, comparing kind of the way things are done in different places. And then as we go further into the later part of the session, we hope it will be much more interactive, and we're very, very keen to hear from all of you about your experiences and the extent to which you are experiencing barriers to implementing adaptation policy, or where there are examples of successes and so on. Just following on from something that Sandrine said just now, one of the things that we have done in preparing for these trainings is we've done quite a significant desk review of all of the different policy documents and reports and laws and so on that different territories have produced over the past probably 20 years or so. We've synthesized them into quite a significant piece of work. So in the next session, one of the things we're going to be presenting to you are our kind of findings and what we think has happened in most of the territories in terms of different kinds of adaptation, mainstreaming, policy, and so on. And we hope that that will stimulate a really, really interesting interactive discussion about, you know, the kind of successes and the different lessons that can be learned and shared across the OCTs. And I guess for people who aren't aware of it, one other thing that's just worth saying at the outset here is that there is an analogous conversation that's taking place to this one later on this evening in European time, but tomorrow morning in Pacific time, where Sandrine and Laetitia and the French colleagues are going to be doing the kind of the same session really, or a very similar session with colleagues in the Pacific overseas countries and territories as well. So I guess, as we said just now, this is the first of a number of different sessions. The list of the 5 sessions you can see here on the slide here. So this is very much an exploratory, introductory discussion. In the next session on Thursday, we're going to talk about how you actually go about mainstreaming climate resilience into policies, into different sectors of a territory. And as we go further on, we're going to be moving much more into conversations about kind of strategic collaborative approaches, and then finishing off with talking about monitoring and evaluation tools. The kind of objective, there are 3 objectives of the sessions as a whole. One is that we're trying to develop a common language and lay the foundations for a common culture on climate change adaptation in OCTs. And to my mind, this probably means 2 things. One is about synthesizing and kind of gaining a degree of consensus on existing concepts and you know, ways of thinking about these problems. But I think there's also something else that we need to do collectively, which is get a sense of the distinctive challenges that small, generally small overseas countries and territories face in implementing these kind of conventional you know, conceptual languages into their own policy context, which, as we know, are very, very distinctive compared to other parts of the world, and in particular larger European metropolitan context. The second thing is to think about helping you, as Sandrine suggested just now, to identify the different barriers and constraints on mainstreaming climate adaptation and resilience policy, but also thinking about some of the levers as well. And one of the things, again, that we've noted from the big synthesis that we've done of all of the kind of the desk review that we've done, is it's quite clear that there are some territories that have had real successes in terms of moving forward in particular areas of mainstreaming, and others that perhaps have experienced different challenges. And that's actually quite uneven across the OCTs as a whole. So it isn't the case, I don't think at least, that some societies have done really well in every aspect and others are struggling in every aspect. It's actually the case that different places are doing well in different aspects of this challenge. So some have found the keys to particular kinds of mainstreaming, and others I guess are still looking for them. So sharing those lessons is really, really important. And then the third objective is understanding the kind of components that are required to progress towards resilience mainstreaming in sectoral policies and regulations. So what are the kind of broad lessons that can be shared so that everybody can go back and help to kind of improve delivery of these kinds of objectives on the ground? And then in terms of today's session specifically, one key objective is developing this kind of shared common language so that we're all on the same page and we all know what we're talking about when we use concepts like adaptation or resilience or mitigation and so on. And as a way of doing this, we're going to try and suggest an outline, what the main frameworks are, thinking about the governance of climate adaptation from the kind of global international level all the way down to the local level, and try and see where some of the spaces for maneuver or for action are that can allow for better integration of adaptation into local policy. One thing we're going to do is an icebreaker quite shortly. We're then going to think about adaptation and resilience and the other key concepts. We'll then talk about the kind of international framework of governance, and then we'll come down through the levels, talking through the European framework and then the UK and Dutch frameworks. That's the kind of, I guess, analytical, synthetic discussion. And then we'll move into a much more kind of discursive back and forth. And that's where I say that we're really hopeful that you'll be able to share many of your experiences with us. Now, we're going to be using a thing called Mentimeter, which I don't know if people are aware of it, but if you could get your mobile phones out now, if you have one, or maybe open a page on a web browser. If you don't, I'm assuming everybody's got a mobile phone. In a moment, we're going to start doing the first of the Mentimeter activities. And these are kind of a fairly easy way to share information and participate without everybody feeling the need and the pressure to put their hands up just at this stage. Yeah, so I'll move on to that slide. And what I'm going to do is just come out of the slideshow now, and then I'm going to share the Mentimeter with you. So if you just give me a second, the instructions for that will come up shortly. Okay. So let me just share that. Okay, so you should be able to see the Mentimeter right now. Is that?
Yes.
Have I shared the presentation again? Apologies. That one there.
Yeah, we can see
that
it.
Mentimeter? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so if everybody should be able to scan the code. And then we'll move on. Has everybody been able to scan the QR code or type in the number?
Yeah.
Guessing so. Okay. We've gone into the French one for some reason.
Can you go back to the QR code so I can scan it? Sorry.
Yes, I can. Just give me 1 second. Let me just.
No problem. Thank you.
Yeah, it is in French. You got it.
I know it. I know it is. Sorry, we had it all set up before we started, and I don't know why that's just happened. For some reason, it's saying Sandrine is presenting this one. Okay. Okay, can you see that now?
Yes.
Yes, it's working.
Okay. We'll wait for 10 seconds or so and let everybody use the QR or enter the code. Okay, I'll see some thumbs up. Okay, great. So getting to know each other. So the question here is, from where are you joining the train? Where are you coming from? Okay, so 22 responses or 23 responses. I mean, that's pretty amazing, isn't it? We've got a really diverse representation. We've got most of the OCTs from the Caribbean and the Pacific and the Atlantic represented, I guess. Majority of people from Anguilla, Turks and Caicos Islands, but everyone else really well represented, which is great. Okay, so really diverse group of people, which is fantastic. The next slide. In which sector are you working? Energy, biodiversity, conservation, etc. Okay, so this is fantastic. We've got a really nice, diverse range of responses here. So obviously some people from the Go team are here, but the majority of people, or a large number of people, working on policy, working for government, implementation, some risk management. We've got coastal management, climate security, lots of people working on energy, sustainable development, and so on. So again, it seems we've got a really nice, diverse group of people. So it'd be really excellent to get everybody's insights into the issues that we're dealing with. And then we're about to, I'll come back to this one in a moment. We're going to go on to talk about adaptation, resilience, mitigation. So what do these concepts mean for everybody? What does it actually mean to you when we talk about these concepts? So that's going to be the focus of the next, sorry, I jumped onto that slide too quickly there. So I'm going to stop sharing the Mentimeter for now, and we're going to come back to that one in a moment. Okay. Sorry, I'm just putting the settings back up. Okay, so that brings us to the first part of the session today, thinking about the different concepts that we're dealing with. So what do these concepts mean to everybody in the room when we talk about them? What does it actually mean to you to talk about these things? Can everybody see the Mentimeter question if I put this up?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay. So what do they actually mean to people? Which ones do people think are mitigation measures here? Introducing or promoting clean transport policies, setting up health facilities that use solar panels for energy, reducing water consumption, drawing up heat action plans. Okay, we've got 10 votes now, or 12 coming in. Everybody's voting now. I think this is a really tricky question. Okay. So, most people went for reducing water consumption, and some people went for heat action plans. Actually, the sense was that it's the first two, introducing and promoting clean transport and setting up health facilities that use solar panels, are about mitigation, because they're essentially about reducing emissions. So give yourself a pat on the back if you got that one right. And we'll come back to the explanation in a moment. So adaptation refers to identifying and understanding vulnerability. Is it the same thing as disaster risk management, or is it a capacity to adjust to hazardous events? Okay, we seem to have a consensus here that it's a capacity to adjust to hazardous events. But there's a sense that actually it could really be all of these things. So what about resilience? What does resilience refer to for people? The capacity to cope with a shock, the capacity to bounce back and reorganize differently, or a capacity to resist and return to a previous state after disturbance? Again, we've got a broad spectrum of answers there. Resilience could really be all of these things. So people are absolutely right to vote for whichever one they think is the most appropriate. We'll come back to those in a minute, and we'll carry on the rest of the discussion for now. So I'm just going to stop sharing the Mentimeter again and come back to the slides. Okay. So when we think about adaptation and mitigation of climate change, the simple kind of definition that is given in the, I guess, the academic literature and the policy literature is that mitigation is broadly about action that reduce emissions that cause climate change. So things that often are seen to happen, I guess, at kind of the global level, kind of the Paris Agreement and other ways of kind of limiting carbon emissions. Adaptation is seen to be something generally that's much more localized, and it's about action to manage the risks of climate change impacts, i.e. finding local mechanisms to deal with the fact that emissions or kind of the temperature is still going, we've still got global warming happening, and the consequences for local communities are something that need to be adapted to. But I think what's less often recognised is that there is a degree of overlap between the two. So there are lots of different policy areas where societies can do different things that allow them to both mitigate and engage in a degree of adaptation. So some of the examples given in this diagram are things like water conservation, new energy systems. So a new energy system that reduces dependence on fossil fuels and thereby is good for mitigation can also have an adaptive effect as well if it makes the energy system of a society more resilient. Education is perhaps another example of it. But then there are other things that are quite obviously primarily adaptive, things like infrastructure upgrades, flood protection, coastal zone management, those kinds of things. Whereas on the clear mitigation side, you know, things like clean energy tend to be seen as broadly about mitigation much more than adaptation. So I suppose the broad point just to take from this is that there is a clear distinction that can be drawn conceptually between the two things, but there is also a degree of overlap between them in practice. Now these concepts have been defined both in the academic literature, as I suggested just now, and also in a whole range of different kind of policy, important policy reports and kind of processes that have occurred in recent decades. We know more and more about the impacts and risks and vulnerabilities and ways of adapting today than we did even in the quite recent past. And the definitions and common language that we have tend to be based on scientific references, which are derived, at least in the first instance, from the work of the IPCC. The IPCC obviously produces these huge reports every year, looking at the state of play in terms of climate change and in terms of the kind of scientific basis for how things are happening. And that then has shaped the way we think about these issues globally. So things like adaptation, resilience, and so on, and all of the other kind of related analogous concepts are kind of a codified language that underpins the way we think about climate change and the way we should respond to it. And these concepts have a long history. They're based on a huge kind of corpus of scientific literature, a significant number of debates that have been ongoing for a very, very long time. And what this means is that the concepts are always evolving. So although we have this kind of core scientific understanding of them, there are significant debates that take place, both in, again, the academic literature and the policy world, about what they actually signify, what they mean. So what does good adaptation actually look like on the ground for a particular society? We might know what it means kind of conceptually in the most basic sort of way, but it might mean quite different things for different societies. And kind of the research community that works on adaptation and resilience is increasingly generating new knowledge based on field studies and case studies that are monitored and described in reports like those that you can see on the screen. So what does this all mean really for when we think about these concepts? Well, kind of if you juxtapose adaptation with resilience, I mean, adaptation, it says on the screen, refers to a process. And I think that's really important. Adaptation isn't something that kind of happens and then stops and is ever completed. It's kind of an ongoing thing that societies across the world have to deal with, of adjusting to actual or expected climate change and its effects in order to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. So that's a really, really important thing. In natural systems, the process of adjustment to actual climate and its effects, human intervention may facilitate adjustment to expected climate and effects. So adaptation is a process of kind of human engineered, if you like, coping really with climate change. And this can have two different kind of dimensions to it. One is incremental, which is something that maintains the essence and integrity of the system at a given scale, or it can be much more transformational. So adaptation that changes the fundamental attributes of a socio-ecological system in anticipation of climate change. I think it's worth bearing this distinction in mind. So there are very, very small things that societies or communities can do to adapt kind of gradually, incrementally. But there are also quite major changes that they can make, but those major changes will have significant consequences for the functioning of the society itself. And I'm sure it's not difficult for people to think of examples of both. Resilience, on the other hand, speaks to the capacity of social, economic, environmental systems to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance. So we might think of a volcanic eruption here, or we might think of some other kind of climatic shock, like a hurricane or something like that. Responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain their essential function, identity, and structure. So how a society kind of builds back to the place it was at before, while also maintaining the capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. So how do you do more than just build back, but how do you move on beyond that situation? And the origin of this concept essentially comes back from this, it derives from this notion of bounce back ability, if you like. How is it that you can return to a previous state after a disturbance? And in natural systems, this happens all the time as a product of different naturally occurring phenomena, but the same is true of kind of human-derived systems as well. And the scientific definition of resilience has evolved to relate to the concept of adaptation. So originally, we could perhaps distinguish between what's sometimes called engineering resilience, i.e. recovery to a previous state, ecological resilience, which means remaining within the prevailing system domain through maintaining important ecosystem processes and functions, and social ecological resistance, i.e. the capacity to reorganize and adapt through multi-scale interactions between social and ecological components of the system. And what all of this means, in a kind of, if you want to put it simply, is how do these different forms of resilience interact to generate and support effective adaptation. So these connections, I think, are really, really important for us to think about as we go through the rest of our conversation, thinking about kind of what resilience is, how we generate it and support it, and what that means for adaptation. So thinking a little bit about adaptation versus disaster risk management, I think there's an important kind of set of distinctions that we might want to make here as well. So disasters, as we know, are severe alterations in the normal functioning of a community or a society due to hazardous physical events interacting with vulnerable social conditions and requiring an immediate emergency response to satisfy human needs. These can be related to natural hazards and climate-driven natural hazards, but adaptation addresses both slow onset events and longer term kind of trends. But preparedness response, recovery, and attempts to build back better can be integrated within adaptation practices and actions. In AR6, they talk about understanding the risks we face that can help in planning for the future. And this can be a combination of short-term preparations, such as early warning systems, and longer-term strategies to reduce vulnerability. So what all of this means really is that disaster risk management is fundamentally about designing, implementing, and evaluating strategies, policies, and measures to improve the understanding of risk, foster reduction and transfer, and promote continuous improvement in preparedness, response, and recovery practices with the explicit purpose of increasing human security, well-being, sustainable development, quality of life. I think adaptation is a process of adjusting to actual or expected climate change and its effects, whereas disaster risk management refers to policies and instruments to reinforce the capacity to prevent, prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters, including climate-driven natural disasters. So what this really, I guess, pushes us to think about is the difference between slow onset, long-term structural change in the profile of a particular society when it comes to climate and environment, and also how that intersects with sudden onset events and disasters. The two are related to each other because often those disasters can be intensified by the long-term change of the climate, but they're also distinct from each other as well, and they're separate, even though they might overlap. So we can see this quite clearly from the diagram that's there on the slide, that there is an area of overlap between the two, where they kind of impact upon each other in complex ways. So we come to another Mentimeter stop at this point in time. So I'm just going to stop this slide here and come back to that, if that's okay. So that is up in there. Everybody can see the Mentimeter? Okay. Is everybody there? Do people need to see the QR code again or anything?
Yes, Matt, I'm just jumping in to say I have put the QR code and the code to connect in the chat, so you can find it.
Okay, cool. I haven't jumped too far forward on the Mentimeter here, have I, Leticia? I can't remember where we got to on the questions, but I think it might be obvious. Okay. Okay. So adaptation is not so much an environmental policy, but rather a fine-tuned spatial planning and economic policy. What do people think to this one? Is it more of an environmental policy, or is it a spatial planning and economic policy? Okay, so we seem to have a consensus. Well, we don't have a consensus, but we have a majority of people thinking that adaptation is much more about spatial planning and economic policy. Fewer people think that it's more of an environmental phenomenon. And I think that tells us something quite interesting, is that this is probably a bit in the eye of the beholder. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that question, in the sense that different people working in different areas will have a different view, I guess, of exactly what's important when we think about adaptation. Okay, so we'll come back to the slide session. So if we start to think about how all of this applies to concrete situations, one of the things that we move towards, I guess, in the discussion is thinking about the complex interlinkages between different processes. This was taken from the IPCC report in 2022, this diagram, and essentially shows that there are a whole set of tensions that exist between the kinds of adaptive measures that can be made across different sectors in order to reduce risks, and the extent to which that can help us generate responses to longer term limiting of global warming. And then there are these really complex feedback loops that occur, the kind of feedback between the two different parts of the processes, and allow for particular kinds of transitional effects, and so on. And there's a whole set of really interesting, if you go and look at the IPCC report and sort of explore some of this, there's some whole set of really interesting insights in there about the importance of kind of timely action, and the way in which action at different scales and at different times can have quite important effects in terms of generating successful adaptation and avoiding what is sometimes called maladaptation, maladaptive processes. This was taken from the same report as well, and shows the whole range of different kinds of activities that could be undertaken in order to generate improvements to particular systems. So there's a whole set of cross-sectoral things that societies need to achieve in order to generate successful mitigation and adaptation, all of which intersect with different kind of sectoral interests and sectoral imperatives, and so on, and all of which have different levels of feasibility as well. So I suppose the wider lesson here really is that attempts to improve things in some areas can have quite significant effects, both positive and sometimes negative, in others. And that brings us on to a conversation around governance. So how do we actually govern the mainstreaming process? How do we as people who are interested and working in this area actually achieve the effects that we want to achieve? I think it's important to emphasize that there's a significant difference between the concept of governance, which is the set of rules and collective processes, whether formalized or not, and that's quite important, by which stakeholders participate in the decision-making and implementation of public actions. These rules and processes are the result of constant negotiation between many players involved, as well as guiding decisions and actions. This facilitates the sharing of responsibility between all the players involved, each of whom possess a certain form of power. Now, this is one of many definitions we could have picked for thinking about governance. And I think it's really important to emphasize that when we talk about governance, we're not just talking about government, which is kind of defined as the formal political process and the institutions of the nation state, the territory in the case of an overseas territory. But we're talking actually about the multi-layered and multifaceted different sources of power that get brought to bear upon different governing processes. This is really, really crucial. A key part of that, of course, is normative power as well. So the power that is exercised in the governance processes by all of those different stakeholders, whether they be civil society actors, whether they be kind of global governance bodies, or whether they be states, or whether they be private actors, private companies in many cases, all have, as that quote suggests, different kinds of power, different levels of power. They can all bring something to bear on the process. And in AR6, in the glossary, there's a comprehensive and inclusive concept of the full range of means for deciding, managing, implementing and monitoring policies and measures. And there are a huge range of actors and institutions involved. I once read that in the climate and environment context as a whole, there are believed to be somewhere in the region of 500 global governance bodies, which is enormous when you think about it. Obviously, the UN tends to be at the top, but emanating out of that, there are huge numbers of bodies that all exercise power of some kind over the process. And when we think about the governance from a local level, we have to start thinking about kind of capacity. And this really speaks to the ability of governance institutions, leaders, non-state actors, civil society to plan and coordinate, fund, implement, evaluate and adjust policies and measures over the short, medium and long term, adjusting for uncertainty, rapid change and wide-ranging impacts. And that's really important for us to then think about adaptation and kind of this concept of adaptive governance that's emerged in the literature in recent times, which considers the formal and informal institutions that prioritize social learning in planning, implementation and evaluation of policy through iterative social learning, i.e. how is it the case that states, civil society organizations, private actors, other levels of governance from the global level right down to the kind of community level can all collaborate together to share lessons and kind of improve this process collectively. And by doing so, steer the use and protection of natural resources, ecosystem services, and common pool natural resources, particularly in situations of complexity and uncertainty. So that complexity and uncertainty is a really, really important thing to think about, because we might not know what the profile of a particular society will be in climate mainstreaming terms in 5 or 10 years' time. We don't know what disasters might hit in the interim. We don't know how much capacity there will be within both formal and informal governance institutions and mechanisms. And mainstreaming simply refers to the integration of adaptation processes within sectoral policies and action plans. Okay, so we come to a bit of Q&A now, and it would be really, really good for me to stop speaking and to get a sense from people of what these contexts mean to you. We've got 4 questions up here. What do these concepts mean to you? How well do they translate to your specific context? Can you share any concrete examples of where adaptation has been successful or maladaptation has been overcome? So where you haven't been able to adapt to a particular problem? And are there lessons or insights that you would like to hear from other places to inform practice in your own jurisdiction? So maybe give people a few seconds to just ponder these questions, but it'd be great if people want to start putting their hands up, and maybe we'll have a discussion for 10 minutes, which would be really, really great. And the richer the answers we can get to these questions at this point, this will really help us with shaping the rest of the sessions over the next few weeks. Does anybody want to come in? Any hands up? Or does anybody want to put anything in the chat? Or are people just being too shy?
Well, I'll take a swing at it.
Thank you very, very much. Can you introduce yourself and where you're from, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure, no problem. My name is Kimani Kitson Walters, policy advisor at policy advisor for agriculture, nature, and environment at the public entity of St. Eustatius. If you're familiar with that island, tiny island between St. Martin and St. Kitts, and by tiny I mean really tiny. So just to, I guess, start with the concepts. I'll go through the 4. What do the concepts mean to me? For me, it's I like to always bring it back to the people. How does it affect the people? Because the reason why climate change has become a big thing is because it's affecting how we live our daily lives. So I really like how some of the concepts that you mentioned basically fall back on that it's really for the people that we're doing all of this for. How well do these translate to my specific context? For us, it's being on St. Eustatius. We're an island that's 21 square kilometers. So we trying to produce our own food, which we're working on at the moment. 96% of our 96% of everything, food, construction material, everything comes through our tiny little port that's on the lowest point of the island. So it will be very influenced by sea level rise, and also increased weather events. We've had a couple of times where we could not get our week's worth of food because the weather was too rough for the boat to come in. And then also our heavy reliance on neighboring islands, for instance, St. Martin back in 2017 when Irma hit, we had to rely on St. Kitts. And then imagine if that hurricane had hit both islands devastatedly, to put it lightly, would have been screwed. Yeah.
So what do people do, Kimani, when that happens, when the boat doesn't arrive for 2 weeks and there's no fresh food deliveries? How do people cope with that?
Canned foods, usually. So most houses have a stock of canned foods that they, in case of emergency, use. Fortunately, we have, in terms of water, there is no natural source of fresh water. So we have a desalination plant, which is also right next to the harbor. And in event of any major storms or storms that would cause coastal erosion, because it sits just below an eroding cliff. So we've had times where, our water station, or desalination plant, and or power station are right beside each other, just below these cliffs. And there's been times when boulders have hit the diesel engine, and we're without power for a few hours. But fortunately, through some funding through the EU, we are at the moment 85% clean energy from solar power. So that's nice. And then hopefully with another EU project that we're doing, at the end of that will be 100% solar. So not too much relying on the on diesel, on fossil fuels for power.
But does that will presumably mean that the island will need to install some battery storage capacity somewhere? Is that right?
Yeah, which we do. Yes, we do have.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. So another adaptive measure I can mention is because we don't have freshwater stores, we are trying our best to harvest as much of the rain as possible. And how we're doing that is using our roads, because we are our island is from like gently sloping to very steep. So all of the roads, when the water hits the roads, they go straight to the sea. So in the last 2 or 3 years, we've been redirecting much of this water into infiltration ponds to limit erosion on the island itself from our agriculture areas, removal of the topsoil, and trying to put much of that water back into the water table on the ground so we can then reuse it via wells. So that's one way we're adapting at the moment. Still a lot more work to do as it relates to that, but we're in the process of it.
That's fantastic. That sounds really clever approach to saving water.
Yeah.
Fantastic, Kimani, thanks. Does anybody else want to come in and give some experiences?
Hi, I'm happy to come in.
Please do.
Hi, so I'm in the Falkland Islands and just at the bottom of the South Atlantic Ocean. So I'm the Climate Change Policy Officer, and so I've been tasked with putting together the climate change risk assessment for the Falkland Islands, as well as the adaptation and mitigation programme. So it's been really useful to sort of have that context of the different definitions, because I think you can easily get bogged down in sort of so much of the different terminology, and so bringing it back down to the sort of the foundational elements just makes it that bit easier to then have the public sort of buy into what you're trying to achieve. So I think just having it on a very, very simple level, this is adaptation, this is mitigation, this is sort of where we hope to try and increase our resilience, just then sort of enables people to then really buy in and sort of I guess come on board with and sort of help get those things going. So we're very, very early in our adaptation sort of policy, but things have been going on in response to a changing climate over many years. So for instance, we've got a huge expanse of peatlands in the Falklands, and so there's a lot of restoration efforts that have been going on. And so it's really nice to actually be able to sort of ensure that we can relay the fact that that's not only adaptation to the changing climate, but also it's a mitigation measure, as well as in trying to increase that sequestration of carbon. And I think what's been quite interesting, and I am keen to hear of any sort of other maladaptation issues, but it's understanding sort of the different timescales of adaptation action. So some are very, very much incremental. So for instance, the restoration that we've been looking at, the effects of that you're not really going to see certainly within the first year or two. It's very much a long-term commitment that you've got in that adaptation program, whereas if you're looking at water resilience, there's quite a lot that we're doing now that sort of gives us, well, it's essentially it's research and evidence collecting to be able to better inform us to make sure that we make those better choices for adaptation measures. And I suppose that sort of then steers into the maladaptation. We're a small community that are quite maxed out in terms of our capacity as it is, and so obviously we do need to put in adaptation measures, but it needs to be well thought out and evidence-based to make sure that we're not going down a route that we're going to regret in the future, but also then take necessary capacity away from sort of business as usual, as it were. So it's trying to sort of marry up where we can, what adaptation procedures we can do that have almost a multiple benefit through the different areas of community, because that's where obviously we can deploy our resources most effectively.
It's interesting you say that you're maxed out, Debbie. Off the top of my head, the population of the Falklands is 1,750?
Around 3,000.
Or 3,000, okay,
3,000.
sorry, apologise. So how do you deal with that when you have really, some territories maybe have 50,000 people, 100,000 people. How do you deal with such a tiny population when you need this, you need some skills as well, don't you, to engage in this kind of activity?
So it's like I said, so it's understanding where there's multiple benefits, and so you can sort of through different sectors within government sort of lend resources. So for instance, within my role, I've had quite a lot to do with the public works side of things in terms of looking at what our water structure and sort of operations are. But it comes down to, I suppose, if we don't have it in-house, it'll be looking at consultancy elsewhere from and sort of information from across other regions. We have got close relationships with St Helena, who have similar sort of problems and challenges, and so I have found that to be really useful, especially I am in my role anyway a department of one, so having that resource, even just from sort of a knowledge base to be able to draw upon has been really helpful, to just say, oh, these are the sort of questions that you need to be asking and exploring to then be able to get the answers that you need. So yeah, it's just extra logistics of small island living. You know, the gentleman before was talking about when the boat doesn't arrive, you know, just 2 weeks ago we've had a bit of a milk drought because you know, we ran out of milk early. So you just learn to sort of deal with what you've got in these small islands and adapt anyway. So people are pretty resilient with the challenges that we're already faced on a day-to-day basis, but it's just making sure that we're utilising our resources to the maximum, really.
That's fantastic insights. Thanks so much. Before anybody else comes in, David has put a comment in the chat where he says that Bermuda has a long-standing adaptation measure in that houses collect rainwater, which is directed to tanks under the houses. We need to look to the future given predictions of more rain, but in heavier events, but less frequent, we may have to reconsider the ratio of tank size to roof collection areas, etc. I mean, this is a really big deal in all islands, isn't it? I mean, the changing rainfall patterns are quite a significant problem. I lived in Trinidad for a long time, and although, you know, Trinidad's much bigger than many of the territories that you all represent, the same problems were there. Like we constantly had problems with flooding. We constantly had problems with water quality or water not being available. Often, well, occasionally our tanks would end up empty, and we didn't have a mechanism necessarily always for collecting the rainwater. So there were real, quite serious challenges that we faced there. Does anybody else want to come in? I mean, I'm really interested in this point that Debbie raised about timescales of adaptation and the difference between kind of long and short-term events.
Yeah, this is Eric. I want to share something.
Hi, Eric. Please do. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm from Turks and Caicos, and I will focus my comments on electricity or energy transition. I like the concept of governance. Last week, we just had 3 days from 8 to 9 in the evening, consulting different utilities, and we discussed the laws, the policies on how the utilities were governed. I want to go on a specific example on rainfall collection. It is mandated under the planning ordinance that when you construct a house, there should be a cistern. And on the electricity side, there are some sectors, there are some districts in the island of Providenciales where they went underground, because in 2017, when you have Category 5 hurricane, about 90% of the electric poles were fallen. And some districts, those who are affluent, they decided to go underground. This issue came out last week, but the issue is money, the budget. It's easy to say that, but in other sides of the island, because of the constraint of the budget, they cannot do. And the budget, the districts that went onto underground are the rich section or districts. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. That was great, Eric. So there's differences between the way in which different parts of the territory experience these kinds of challenges. Does anybody else want to share an experience? We can go for a few more minutes yet, if people do. Morgan has put a message in the chat to say, I'm interested in lessons, insights from other countries in terms of mainstreaming adaptation across government. And I mean, I am too as well. So it'd be really interesting to get a sense from colleagues here who has been involved in trying to implement adaptation policy, and what kinds of challenges have you faced in terms of the governance of that process? Does anybody want to come in on that question? How about you, Morgan? Would you like to say anything? Oh, hello. Who's that? Can you introduce yourself, if that's okay?
Hello, Drexel Glasgow.
Hello.
Deputy Financial Secretary in Virgin Islands. This is an interesting topic and question that is one of the questions I've had as well, because we're actually in the midst of updating our climate change adaptation policy. And so we have a series of meetings this week, looking through the action items that we've had from that. And literally ongoing in advanced stages, ongoing. And so these I think that, you know, it's always these type of policies, it's never on the front burner. It's always appeared to be on the back burner. So I'll be interested in understanding how persons how actually make this thing a priority. Because again, though it's in the version, it is very much a priority. We actually we have instituted a ministry, and part of their portfolio is literally climate change. So that's some good things that we're doing. And that's just about a year ago, the change in government. But again, once these meetings are called, once these documents are it's always these strategies, and I'm looking through it, see like a lot of the legislation, a lot of the policies, internal policies, created across different sectors, but it's always seemed as at the back burner. So I'll be interested, of course, to hear, as Morgan has pointed out, just insights as to how we can mainstream and how we can get it to the forefront.
So that's kind of a precursor thing, isn't it, Drexel? That's great. I mean, it's like this kind of sense that even before we talk about the actual process of mainstreaming, we have to bring the issue higher up the political agenda. And I suppose the question I've got, and this is a rhetorical question maybe, is the extent to which, is this about the nature of the issue itself? Is it that it's very, very difficult to make this a priority because it's so big and it's so difficult and it's so complex? Or is it about just some political will? You need some political support for those things. Debbie's got a hand up. Would you like to come in, Debbie?
Yeah, just in response to the mainstreaming, again, we're not at that point ourselves, but sort of when I've sat down to discuss this with colleagues and sort of where we envisage it, what from our point of view, I believe is that if you can integrate climate change response into as many different areas of government as possible, then it's not solely to sit within, for instance, within my role to then ensure that whatever policies and procedures for adaptation then take place. And then you'd have some form of monitoring where you'd maybe have like a bit of an audit of the progress of each of the different adaptation policies over a particular length of time. But when I first came into the role, I was very sort of concerned at how big an adaptation policy would be, and it's not for one person to actually achieve. And so I think there has to be some way of disseminating the responsibility to different areas of government, with that sort of responsibility being held within those different areas, but then ultimately feeding back on a particular timescale in terms of how that is progressing. But similarly, then that links back to climate change risk assessment, because there might be emerging risks that maybe weren't first identified. So it sort of should go hand in hand with sort of monitoring of all risks across all areas that you maybe aren't particularly focusing on at the current time. That's sort of how I envisage that we're going to roll that out, because it's too big for one person, I'd say.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a tension there as well, because it seems to me that implicitly, I think I definitely agree with you that mainstreaming climate across as many areas of policy is the way to go. But once you do that, you're kind of saying that this is the most important policy issue. It's the thing that has to be at the centre of everything else, and everything has to kind of orbit around that. Does that then create tensions elsewhere, particularly where you might have areas of the policy-making process or vested interests within that don't see things quite the same way, and perhaps see that other themes maybe they don't necessarily accept that this reinforces other areas of policy. They may think that it undermines or something. Again, I'm really speculating now. I don't know.
I guess that's where the political will side of things comes in, to sort of give you that backup really to get it integrated as much as you can.
Yeah.
But it's simple things that I was thinking of, linking to what somebody said in the chat, in terms of like rainwater harvesting and things. Like, is there a way of being able to sort of future-proof new builds to consider reduced energy usage, rainwater harvesting, you know, like just as a sort of like a base layer? Can that be integrated into policy for planning applications and things like that? I don't know. It's sort of other questions that we've been looking at exploring.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Does anybody else want to come in on any of these questions at this point?
Yes. I had a comment.
Hi, David.
Possible.
Yeah.
David Northcott, I'm a policy analyst in the Ministry of Home Affairs in Bermuda. It was quite interested in some of the early comments about particularly the mainstreaming. We've had a climate change study done. It's going to cabinet very shortly, and we have set up a climate change task force. It's very loose and informal at the moment, but it's across ministries. And I just would be interested to hear how other OCTs have implemented, if they're done that in terms of implementing some of the strategies. And I'm sort of particularly thinking about whether it's through a department that's been created, or whether a cross-ministerial working group that's been created, or that sort of thing. I would find really interesting, as we're about to launch into that ourselves.
It's Bermuda, isn't it, David, that has the Bermuda Plan, which is like a hugely comprehensive document. Yeah, so I mean, my sense from doing the desk review of all of the documents from across the territories was that Bermuda has a really well developed set of processes and policies and so on that are really quite comprehensive and quite across the board. And I'd be really interested to hear what the answer to your question is from other people. I mean, how have other territories done this? My sense is that much depends on the size of a territory. So it seems to me that the smaller a territory, the more likely it is to be something that's focused within sometimes the governor's office, depending on the territory, and sometimes the premier's office. But it'd be great to hear what other people think. Drexel.
Yes, thank you. In the BVI, we actually have a committee that's across all ministries, all sectors, and as I mentioned earlier, this is actually the weekend. Actually, tomorrow is this big global meeting that we would have everybody come together, but it's across our sectors. Policy itself, the different activities, I'm looking at it, 133 activities over all sectors, and it ranges from, of course, the beach tourism sector, insurance and banking, security, human health, critical infrastructure, and energy security. So those are our focus, and as you can tell from the voucher by the name of those, it's really across several sectors that we have put together under legislation. And one of the things that we try to do as well, and through coming out of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, we had that loan from the Caribbean Development Bank. But one of the things that was a key feature of that loan was to ensure that we have climate change adaptation and mitigation embedded into the projects. And so one of the things that we would do is, and we have followed on to the larger projects that we do, is to at least include a statement as to how we're gonna think about climate. So a lot of our designs start to think about climate change, because we know, well, at least for the BVI, Irma did not do us very well. So, it's very in the front of, I think we have the political backing as well, because as I mentioned, there was a whole new portfolio that was placed. But to be very specific, to answer the question, we use across all different sectors.
That's fantastic. Does anybody else want to share an experience of this? Morgan?
I just have a question for David and Dr. Drexel. Do you guys have any legislation like Climate Change Act or anything like that to kind of give teeth to the task force and the committee that you guys spoke of?
I can go first. We don't, and that was kind of what I was alluding to, because we're in the process of now formalizing, setting terms of reference, etc., for the climate change task force. And we've looked around various other jurisdictions, and places like Mauritius have a climate change act, and they have a. Pardon?
Sorry? Sorry,
No.
David, just carry on.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of did finish. Yeah, we're at the stage where we're now thinking the best route forward, whether it's through an act, whether it's through various ways. So the answer is it's to your question. Sorry, I didn't get the name. But our climate change task force is very informal at the moment. It's ad hoc, and it's not formalized with any specific terms of reference, etc.
Yeah, as for us, we're very much legislated, and I think that's the way to go, because you really are going to need some teeth in the things that you do. And so coming out of that, of course, was this great big policy, and even to set up a climate change fund. So that is something that again had garner some flexibility and support on the political level. And so it's quite I think that's the way to go, to ensure that it's at least legislated.
Yeah. Does that answer the question for you, Morgan? Yep, that's a thumbs up. Great. Does anybody else want to come in on these questions? If not, we can move on. There's going to be another opportunity towards the end of the session to have another open discussion like this. So we'll move on to the international perspectives now. I can get the slides to move forward. Okay, so we're coming to the different international perspectives, so looking at the different kind of frameworks of governance now, and there's a few things to get through on that, but before we do, we've got another Mentimeter discussion, so I'll just switch back to that very quickly. And hold on, sorry, that's the wrong. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, and has everybody still got the QR code and the code? Or does anybody need me to put that up again? I can put it up again. No, we've got thumbs up. That's good. Okay, so okay, looks like everybody's almost ready. Okay. So what do people think? Which of the following proposals are key provisions of the Paris Agreement on climate change? This is something we're going to come to in a moment. 5-year cycles of increasingly ambitious climate action, focusing global climate finance on mitigation efforts and technologies, keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels, or even 1.5 to stay alive is the famous demand of small islands globally, and a global review every 5 years on the state of implementation. Okay, we seem to have a fair bit of consensus on 2 degrees of warming or 1.5 to stay alive. Actually, all of these things, except for the focus in climate finance on mitigation efforts and technologies, are within the Paris Agreement. They're all there. The reason that I guess number 2 was wrong is because there's kind of seemed to be an equal balance between mitigation and adaptation within the different the Paris Agreement and different global agreements that flow out of it. But absolutely, I think the 1.5 to stay alive demand is still absolutely totemic on the part, particularly of small island developing states, but also low-lying countries as well. Okay, all right. So we're going to move on now to the discussion of the international frameworks. And I'm sure some of this will be quite well known to many of you. Essentially, it's the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, that governs essentially climate action. So although I said earlier that there are hundreds and hundreds of what we might consider global governance bodies of different kinds doing work in this area, the UNFCCC kind of sits at the top of all of those processes. In 1988, they created the IPCC, and it was the Rio Convention in 1992 that was absolutely crucial in the UN and its member states taking seriously the problem of anthropogenic climate change. And ever since then, we've got this significant kind of groundswell of action that has occurred ever since and has gradually intensified over time, to the extent that today we now have 198 signatories of the UNFCCC, which is 197 independent states and the European Union as a significant actor. And it was just a few years after this that the first Congress of the Parties, the first COP, took place in 1995. And I think it's really important just to make the point here that the 1990s were really, really key as a period of kind of global governance action on the part of, in particular, small island developing states as well. So it was around this time as well that you had the very first international conference on SIDS, which took place in Barbados. And as I'm sure everybody's aware, the fourth one is going to take place in Antigua at the end of next month. So this was a really, really fertile period for both kind of global climate action, but also activity on the part of small islands and their kind of proponents in terms of getting their special challenges recognised within international frameworks and international fora. The Paris Agreement is the kind of apex, if you like, of this process. It took decades to get to this point. But essentially, the Paris Accord is absolutely crucial. In 2015, so nearly a decade now, although it perhaps doesn't feel like quite that long ago to many of us. This was the first universal agreement that committed all countries, including developing countries, to begin to make commitments in order to ultimately reduce emissions and help to mitigate climate change. So there was still a recognition of what is called in the literature common but differentiating responsibilities, i.e. a sense that developing countries that didn't benefit from kind of the industrial revolution of the 19th century and the continued accretion of emissions ever since would get some leeway to engender their own development through the exploitation of fossil fuels and so on. And this was kind of a fundamental principle of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. But ultimately, there was a sense that by the time we get to Paris, that kind of, while you have to maintain that distinction, it was also the case that increasingly larger developing countries, particularly, would have to begin to also make similar kind of commitments to the kind of the Western countries, if you like. And this is really, really significant because obviously some of those countries have developed quite rapidly in recent years and are absolutely enormous and pollute quite significantly. They contribute to quite a significant share of global pollution. At the same time, some of those countries, China being the obvious example, has actually also developed huge amounts of green technology capacity. So this is kind of a double-edged sword, I guess. So this agreement essentially reiterated the need to keep global warming below 2 degrees, ideally below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Current trajectories suggest that we're unlikely to meet 1.5 degrees Celsius the way things are going. But the Paris Accord also took into consideration adaptation as something that was absolutely critical alongside mitigation. So where Kyoto had really focused primarily on mitigation, and there's kind of a sense, if you read much of the academic literature on climate change politics, there's a sense that mitigation activity has kind of swallowed up over the years the lion's share of money and resources, and adaptation efforts have been a kind of a poorer sibling, if you like, to that activity. By the time we get to the Paris Agreement, this was not the case. There seemed to be both absolutely crucial. And there was a reiteration, as I suggested just now, of this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, and a recognition that different countries, different societies have different capabilities and capacities to either contribute to mitigation efforts or adapt themselves. And we can think about this quite clearly if we think about the situation in many small islands. The cost of completely changing the transport system, for example, implies relative sunk costs that are quite significantly higher than might be the case in a larger country where you have bigger populations using those new transport networks and so on. The Conference of the Parties, which I mentioned just now, and again, I'm sure you're all aware of this, is the supreme body of the different UN conventions, which comprises the parties with a right to vote that have ratified or acceded to the convention. So the COP meets every year in a different part of the world in order to continue pushing forward, really, the global agenda when it comes to climate change. And you can see from that small diagram there that there was a whole set of different things that the Paris Agreement kind of mandated, if you like. A big one is the idea that rich countries will provide 100 billion to developing countries for climate change adaptation by 2020. Now, by the time we get to today, in real terms, that 100 billion is quite a lot more than 100 billion was in 2015. And one of the laments, and we've done quite a lot of work on this at ODI in recent times, is that rich countries have continually failed actually to provide that amount of financing. The idea is that every 5 years, countries shall revise their emissions reduction targets and measures, and so on and so forth. I think the emissions reduction part of this conversation is really, really important when we think about mitigation. And it's particularly important for the kinds of conversations we're going to have about the kind of domestic governance processes, in the sense that actually a lot of the richer countries have committed now to quite ambitious reductions in greenhouse gas emissions over the coming years and decades. And there's actually quite a significant transformation going on globally in terms of this wider move to what is often called net zero. And that's something I'll come back to in a moment. So this shows the kind of engagement of different parties within the global climate agreement as laid out under Paris. And essentially, every country contributes to global mitigation through what are called its nationally determined contributions, its NDCs. And every 5 years, countries have to reiterate and specify what those commitments are. And this becomes a binding document. And so there's a high level of ambition that's embodied or embedded in this process. And there's a constant drive for improvement. The EU has recently tabled its own NDC, which is embedded within its Green Deal. And one of the things that we've seen happen, I think, quite remarkably in the last 2 or 3 years is the United States and the EU, especially, investing huge amounts of money into a kind of green technology and attempts to engage in kind of a green industrial strategy, if that's not an oxymoron, essentially to try and transition out of the most polluting sectors, while also kind of generating a competitive edge to deal with the rising industrial power of, in particular, China, but not exclusively China. Each country undertakes, as appropriate, adaptation and planning processes that respect the guiding principles of the common framework. I think, Eric, if you've got a question there, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I just want to raise the issue of countries or territories without an NDC. I believe that NDC is one of the features of the Paris Convention, but there are some territories, I believe, the Turks and Caicos has no NDC. So how shall we deal with that? Thank you.
I wish I had the answer. Let's leave that on the table. I think that's a really, really important question that we'll return to. So we'll leave that on the table and return to that later on in the session, because I think that's a really important question, and it'd be really great to get other people's perspectives on that. I think a wider question is what happens when countries miss their NDCs as well. Where are the enforcement mechanisms that exist in order to kind of enforce compliance? It's very hard to enforce compliance with environmental law and legislation in a way that is not the case in other areas of policy, like trade policy, and so on. But yeah, there are a whole set of kind of ambition mechanisms, if you like, in the Paris Agreement. And there's a sense that parties, so in Article 7.1, it says that parties establish a global goal on adaptation of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience and reducing vulnerability, with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal referred to in Article 2, i.e. 1.5 or 2 degrees. But there's a strong sense that all the way from 2015 right up to 2050, there's a sense that by the time we get to 2050, globally, we should have reached essentially net zero and a significant degree of climate resilience. So there's a global stock take that is carded for 2028, and the new updated NDCs that countries are supposed to submit by 2030 are going to be absolutely critical in terms of getting us up towards that point. That then brings us on to the European framework. And Europe, as I suggested, has been pretty ambitious on these targets in recent times. So there was a new strategy on climate change adaptation that was published in 2021, which offers a kind of long-term vision of adaptation to the impact of climate change, with the ambition of a resilient Europe by 2050. So it's embedded very much in the kind of wider framework of the Paris Agreement. This built on the first strategy, or the previous strategy of 2013, and it occurred by way of an evaluation that was undertaken in 2018 with a public consultation in 2020. And in May 2022, the various EU institutions created the first ever European climate risk assessment, which was a kind of expert-led assessment of current and future climate change impacts and risks in Europe, covering the environment, economy, and wider society. Now, this report is expected to be published imminently, which will have quite a significant impact, I think, in shaping the next stage of EU governance around these areas. But the vision that's embedded within the European strategy of 2021 has sort of 4 dimensions, each of which broadly align with both the Paris Agreement and this wider Green Deal agenda that I talked about just now. One is smarter adaptation, i.e. improving knowledge of impacts and the cost of damage, and so on. Another is faster adaptation, i.e. speeding up the implementation of adaptation. So getting to a point where communities and societies are able to put adaptive measures in place well in advance of new shocks arriving. More systemic adaptation is the third, i.e. supporting the deployment of adaptation policies and actions at different scales and for all sectors with various priorities, integration into fiscal policy, promoting nature-based adaptation solutions, which I think is something we'll talk a lot over the next few sessions. And also very local solutions, so drawing on kind of local knowledge and expertise. And then the fourth is increasing support for international action in favour of adaptation, i.e. this is the kind of EU's outward agenda. And there's a whole sense that there's a kind of approach to what they call mission adaptation, which is about helping European regions, cities and municipalities to better understand climate risks, prepare, test and deploy concrete and innovative solutions. So this is essentially the EU spreading its budget around the European Union as a whole to try and generate adaptive action. This was grounded in the European Climate Act of 2021, or kind of dovetailed with it, if you like. This was primarily focused on mitigation and the achievement of net zero targets. The legally binding objective was essentially translating the Green Deal into law. And the kind of the tagline of this is the idea that the EU is striving to be the first climate neutral continent. Whether or not that will be achieved remains to be seen. And I think it's just worth mentioning the point that all of the kind of metropolitan countries, if you like, have this kind of twin track policy agenda. So there's an adaptive agenda and there's also a mitigation agenda. And by and large, mitigation is essentially grounded in this kind of attempt to move towards net zero, attempting to completely decarbonize the economy. And it's really important to note that when we think about mitigation in the European context, that there's a sense that this links to adaptation as well. So there's a resilient dimension to the mitigation effort that links the two things together, a bit like in the Venn diagram that I showed earlier that had a whole set of activities in the middle that were both adaptive and mitigatory. So there's a sense that this is about enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience and reducing vulnerability. There's a sense that there's a need to facilitate national adaptation strategies through what they call a favourable regulatory environment. We can debate what that means, while taking into account vulnerability and risks in sectors such as agriculture, water and food systems, promoting nature-based solutions. And there's a kind of imperative that programmes have to set out in their multi-annual financial framework to ensure they're resilient to climate change. So this is about kind of mainstreaming climate change into all different parts of the policy making process across a whole range of sectors. That then brings us on to the UK and Dutch frameworks, but we've got another Mentimeter before we go into those. So I will just stop the share again and open up the Mentimeter here. Okay, got a few thumbs up there. Okay, so there's some questions here about the kind of national level response. Is it the case that public health plans can identify the health risks associated with climate change? I think we're going to get a consensus on this one. Okay, so one person thought not. Unfortunately, it is true. Of course, public health is absolutely, climate change is absolutely critical to public health responses. And maybe we can talk about that in a moment if people would like to have a chat about this. But it seems to me that we don't talk about climate change enough in terms of human health, both physical and mental well-being as well. I think there's a generational effect to this potentially in terms of the kind of public health challenge and the mental health challenge of climate change. Agricultural policies, this is the next question, must reflect the decline in crop yields. Is that true or false? Okay, we seem to have a bit of a consensus on this one. A few people thought it was false, and they were correct, it seems. So agricultural policies don't necessarily have to reflect the decline in crop yields. I guess the sense here is that it might not be the case that crop yields are always declining necessarily everywhere. So this might be quite a contextual picture in different places. Risk prevention plans must take account of the rise in sea level associated with climate change. Okay, we've got a consensus on that one. And one person said false. And it seems that they were correct. Apparently, risk prevention plans don't need to take account of the rise in sea level associated with climate change. I'm not sure we've got that one right, but we'll come back to that anyway. Infrastructure is designed to take account of the future impacts of climate change up to 2050. Okay, we don't have a consensus on this. So if anyone said the false is right, my sense here is that the false is right, because I think it would be nice to have infrastructure that's designed to take account of future impacts of climate change. But it isn't, and it's not always the case that those kinds of objectives are honoured very well in policy. So that's the end of the Mentimeter. And let's go back to the presentation and we'll move on. So we don't have many more slides left. What I thought we would do on these slides is really just talk about how firstly, the future warming scenarios in the UK and the Netherlands. I mean, these are not entirely relevant to everybody in the OCTs, given how distant most of the OCTs are from the metropole. But it's fairly clear that there are really troubling things that are potentially ahead of us as the temperature warms. So the IPCC now has quite clear ideas of exactly what different levels of warming might mean for different societies and so on. And they tend to have these different intervals that they look at. So what happens with 1.5 degrees of warming, which is where we would hopefully limit it to ideally, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees over pre-industrial levels. And to ensure a degree of coherence of actions to adapt and to move forward, we require kind of shared action and agenda in order to deal with that. But there are a whole set of unresolved questions here that I think will be really interesting for us to explore collectively. What climate should we prepare for? How do we know what the likely level of warming is ultimately going to be? What does that mean if we do reach globally net zero by around 2050? How will that intersect with the warming climate? Will it actually even be able to slow down certain degrees of warming that are already kind of baked into our current industrial expansion? And how will it affect very different ecosystems, geographies, topographies, and societies? So the OCTs themselves, as you all know, are very, very different places. They have very, very different topography. Society is different. The geography of those territories is very, very different. But you can see from this diagram that the hotter things get, and this is just for the UK, and by implication, it'd be very similar for the Netherlands, things are going to get more and more bad the hotter things get. So, you know, in the UK, we had a couple of days last summer that were over 40 degrees, which is kind of unprecedented in my lifetime, really. And it seems that we're going to get many, many more days of those if we get up to anywhere near 3 or 4 degrees of warming. We're not going to get as many cold days. We're going to get much more heavy rainfall, which means more flooding, but we're also going to get more droughts. So that's a really, really troubling picture when we then think about how that intersects with, you know, with our food systems, with our flood management, with our infrastructure, any kind of infrastructure, transport infrastructure or social infrastructure, and so on. The UK has a series of emerging policy frameworks, and you can see a few of the documents there. I think the diagram is really interesting as well. And it shows that 5 of the warmest years that the UK has ever experienced have basically occurred since 2016 up to 2020. I think you can include last year and the year before it as well, if that was a more recent diagram. And the coolest years were obviously all in the very distant past. So the average temperature is getting much, much hotter. I remember reading a really interesting quote on the day of one of the 40-degree days a couple of years ago that said that any child that's born now, this is going to be one of the coolest summers they ever experience in my lifetime, the way things are going. And the UK actually has a really, really well-developed policy framework for coping with climate change. The Climate Change Act in 2008 committed the UK to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 100% of 1990 levels by 2050. So the UK was already thinking about net zero quite early on. And the Climate Change Committee, the CCC, which does a lot of the monitoring of UK policy in this area, its report on net zero in 2019 directly influenced that 100% target that then has become more and more embedded in policy in recent years. The Department for Energy Security and Net Zero leads on mitigation activity, and the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs DEFRA leads on adaptation. And those of you that are in British OTs, I'm sure, come into contact with people from those organisations all the time. You're well aware of this, I'm sure. The net zero strategy that was published in 2021 sets out a vision for a market-led, technology-driven transition to decarbonise the UK economy. And then the net zero growth plan in 2023 links that decarbonisation to wider UK competitiveness strategy. And I think it's just worth making the point that this is quite a distinctive approach to governing the net zero transition. The UK has a particularly, I guess, liberal kind of commercial kind of approach to this. It's not probably as interventionist as you might find in other places. So if you think about the kind of the Green Deal of the EU, which is hugely interventionist and you know, sees significant amounts of public financing being pushed towards particular sectors, it doesn't work quite like that, I don't think, in the UK. The UK's is a more kind of market-led approach, and even under a putative Labour government, which is looking like it is fairly likely to happen at some point this year when we have an election, even Labour have scaled back some of their plans to engage in quite significant green investment. So we might see some kind of slight softening around the edges of that agenda, but we probably won't see the same kind of heavy interventionism that you've seen in the European context. The UK's adaptation framework can be seen if you look at some of these documents that are up there. The third National Adaptation Programme, which is shorthanded NAP3, runs from 2023 last year until 2028. And the adaptation framework that the Climate Change Committee implemented first in 2010 was also refreshed in 2023. So there's kind of a new set of agendas that are guiding this activity and have been since last year. And there are three pillars to this. One is what they call monitoring maps. And again, if you look in the documents, you'll see some really interesting diagrams that show exactly how they do all of this. And this essentially maps specific outcomes that they want to achieve, particular goals, enabling policies to specific sectoral contexts. So what are the natures? What is the nature of the particular kinds of activities that need to occur in a particular sector, let's say agriculture, in order to achieve particular kinds of transitional activity? The second pillar is about evaluating progress, and there are two parts to this. One is, you know, how well has policy been delivered and implemented, again, in particular areas and particular sectors, and what new policies and plans are being developed in order to continue progress in those areas. And there are also a series of recommendations that are made through the monitoring process for both further policy, so moving on beyond existing ways of doing things, but also in assessing the extent to which previous recommendations have been implemented. And this diagram that I took from one of the documents shows how the CCC thinks about this issue in terms of its 10 principles for successful adaptation. So there are a whole set of different things that encompass what they call a vision for a well-adapted UK, and the kinds of things that need to happen in order to see it achieved. And as again, we all know that the adaptation framework underpins the wider policy context in which the UK OTs have to navigate. So in terms of kind of engaging with things like Darwin Plus and, you know, kind of the activity of DEFRA and the JNCC and so on. So that's the UK framework. The Netherlands framework, in certain respects, is similar. perhaps unsurprisingly. So the Dutch Climate Act of 2019 legally binds the government to reduce emissions by 95% of 1990 levels by 2050. So it's not quite 100% as it is in the UK case, but it's not far off. There was an integrated national energy and climate plan published in 2019, which envisages 55% emissions reduction as soon as 2030, which is pretty ambitious, and then fits with the global stocktake as well. There's a gradual phasing out of coal-fired power by 2030. The Netherlands still has quite significant amounts of coal-fired power, although a number of authors think that target might be reached sooner than 2030, potentially. And there's also going to be the ending of natural gas extraction from the Groningen field by 2028. Again, some people think that will happen sooner. Most households in the Netherlands use natural gas from that field, but kind of central to the Netherlands transition is the adoption of a national hydrogen strategy, and some regions are aiming to achieve 100% energy generation from renewable hydrogen, which is hugely ambitious. And I think that, again, this speaks to what we're living through is like quite a significant transition. Like, this is a huge transition compared to the way we've done energy and the way we've done kind of policy in these areas up until very, very recently. And there's a wider set of programs, given that the Netherlands is obviously so low lying, that are encompassed in the Delta program for spatial adaptation, which is all about reducing water logging, flood impact. And so the Netherlands' ambition broadly is to be both climate proof and water resilient by 2050. So that brings us on to another conversation. We've got about 10 minutes or so left. I'm really keen to get people's views here and get a sense of where people stand on these questions. If anybody would like to revisit Eric's question about what we do about territories that don't have an NDC, or whether that's something that others are grappling with. And if not, we've got a whole bunch of other questions here for people to think about. Have there already been action plans dedicated to adaptation? I've given the example of Bermuda there as a country that has got quite far along this road. Are there other examples that people want to talk about? How does the planning landscape represent an opportunity for your sector that you work in particular? Are there any sectoral plans under review or being defined that you're looking for more guidance on and more help with? How could resilience to climate change be integrated into this new plan? And where are the gaps and what learning is required for you from the experience of other OCTs? So, as I say, we've got 10 minutes left, so it'd be great to just get people's views on some of these questions. Does anybody want to kick us off? Hi, Eric, please come in.
Yeah, I mentioned a while ago that Turks and Caicos has no NDC, but that doesn't mean that we are not doing anything. For example, we have a document here. I don't know if you can read. The TCI Resilient National Energy Transition Strategy. So we have a target by 2040 that the energy in TCI will be 33%. It's lower than the others, but we might adjust this with all the international commitments. We also conduct IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan for the energy sector. Please note that I'm talking more on the energy sector because we have a colleague who are from the climate change, the Department of Environment. So I decided and I made a communication with them that I'll focus my comments on the energy. So just as mentioned a while ago, we have a bill, we have a draft law that will be talking on renewable energy. And we believe that after the passage of that law, there will be more who will put solar PVs on their rooftops, because we receive a lot of inquiries about the regulation on how to put solar photovoltaic in the rooftop or ground mount. But we don't have the law. That's why we drafted the law and it passed through the first reading in the House, in the Congress. Thank you.
Okay. Eric, can I just ask you a question? Do you find that the law is enough? I mean, how do you move from actually drafting a law, having it on the statute book, and then actually seeing it implemented? I mean, is there how do you pursue that? How do you ensure that it's kind of taken notice of and it has kind of effect, if you like?
The law that I was talking is the renewable energy law. So in that law, it will provide the framework of allowing utilities, residential houses, businesses to put up their solar PVs. So as I said a while ago, there will be a multi-sector regulatory body. Currently, we are the regulatory body, very small department, but we will be establishing a big regulatory body to encompass fuel, water, electricity, and telecom. So there will be one big regulatory body because all these services are important to us, and there should be a group that will monitor them, that will regulate them. So there will be a police power, talking of enforcement, to be placed in the law. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks. Does anybody else want to come in on these questions?
I just want to ask Erica a quick question. We are in the, my name is John. I work in the Ministry of Finance and I'm an architect by trade.
In which territory, John?
I'm in the
Where are you
Virgin
based?
Islands. The Virgin Islands. And my question to him is, when they're putting, in our case, in the Virgin Islands, we are susceptible to lots of hurricanes and so. How would they regulate the installation of those and also mitigation of insurance in the event that there is a storm and these things are tossed around because they were not removed and they damage others' property? I would like to know what is their plan on that.
Yeah, on the installation of, let's pick up one area, solar street lights. We require the installation to withstand Category 5 hurricane. On solar PVs, for the rooftop, currently the private companies are giving guarantee for 25 years that if the panels will be removed by hurricane, they will change for free. We also discussed in the multi-sector, it's not yet finalized, but we discussed about creating a disaster fund because we know in the utility sector, there are insurable assets and non-insurable assets. Of course, for the insurable, the insurance will answer that. For the uninsurable, that's the area where the proposed disaster recovery fund to answer, so that the business, the disruption of the business will not be too long. So we want to reduce the disruption. Thank you.
Oh, so Eric, just quickly, in the case of missiles flying, in the case of hurricane, it might be able to withstand, but what about missiles? And in the case of the Virgin Islands, we had a lot of missiles, including roofs and so, and even containers flying around. How would you mitigate? That's what my question really was really about, the missiles that would destroy those things. Not that they're not, wouldn't be able to be placed there, and if the wind was clean without any debris, that they would stand on the roof. That was not my question.
Thank you. I understand that because I'm a victim of that. My car windshield was broken in 2017. Yeah, that's difficult. Yeah, that's a difficult question. And we did not discuss that. Thank you for raising that. I think that needs to be discussed in a formal forum so that we can present that to the insurance companies or to different governments.
Okay.
Sorry, I cannot answer that. Thank you.
Okay, right.
Okay. Does anybody else want to come in with any comments or thoughts on any of the questions? Or do I take it that everybody's tired and ready to wrap up, given that we've been going for 2 hours nearly? Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. It's been a really, really interesting session for me. I feel like I've learned a lot from all of you. We meet again on Thursday where we're going to look at the levers for integrating climate resilience into sectoral policies. So we'll be presenting the research that we did, looking at doing the desk review of all of the different policy documents from different territories and so on. And the Ramboll team will be presenting their tool as well. And then we can think, I guess, more practically about how we move on from these kind of conceptual questions into more practical dimensions of mainstreaming resilience. Thank you all for coming. I guess we'll wrap up there and hope to see you all again on Thursday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Hi guys, just a quick query from me. I'm actually away for the next 2 sessions. Will there be recording that will be shared that means that I can just catch up?
That's a yes. And
Cool.
the recordings will be posted as soon as they're edited and ready on our Go platform, and we'll share via that platform any related materials and whatnot produced by Matt and the team, and so you can follow it there.
Perfect. Thanks very much, guys. See you.
Good to have you, Debbie. See you soon.
Yeah, absolutely.